Hey y'all, welcome back and welcome to this video that is sort of the main feature of Module 5. Congrats, you've made it past the midpoint. By this point, your genograms have been turned in, most likely, and I'm in the process of reviewing them, providing feedback, and helping to set you up nicely for part 2 of your signature assignment, which of course is your family of origin analysis paper. In this module, we are covering primarily psychoanalytic and psychodynamic models to family therapy. You'll read about a couple of them and sort of also get a bit of a history lesson about how psychodynamic theory has affected sort of the giants in family therapy. You'll notice that Bowen, Mnuchin, and others were all sort of trained as analysts prior to beginning their work related to family therapy. And some of them sort of stay close to psychoanalytic theory and practice, while others sort of, like Mnuchin, like Bowen kind of stuck close. Mnuchin and Haley and others sort of made their own way, which still in many ways employed, or at least gave acknowledgement and credit to psychodynamics as it related to what we now think of as cybernetics, and how patterns affect the family system and maintain presenting problems, sometimes even create and maintain psychopathology, and then developing interventions for taking those patterns and tweaking them so that they can people can achieve developmental goals and relieve that suffering. So if you're like me at all, I'll put it this way, if I were interested, I would be wondering, like, why are we talking about this now? Like, isn't the semester almost over with, and wasn't sort of psychoanalysis the foundation of psychotherapy? And so I just want to start, I guess, with a bit of an answer to that. So yes, that's true. Psychoanalysis is considered the earliest formalized model of psychotherapy, at least in Western society. But it emerged, I should say, first of all, this helped humanity organize its thoughts and understanding about human psychological and personality development. But it emerged at a time of human history that was also marked by very disturbing perspectives, right? So psychoanalysis was developing in the late to early part of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Freud was at the height of his work in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s. And of course he was living in Austria and within sort of what became the Third Reich. So the period of time that psychoanalysis is coming to the fore is really affected in many ways by the ethnocentrism of white people that then had previously and in those moments was supporting colonialism, racism, classism, etc. Also, psychoanalysis has been criticized because it is very positivistic in nature. We have sort of an expert in the room telling and making interpretations from the perspective that there is a single, objective, knowable reality. And it's also very individualistic in nature, even though Freud was known for appreciating the effects of early childhood relational experiences upon the adult psyche. The work or his approach was very much sort of treating a single patient in what was kind of like a quasi-vacuum, right? Like his perspective was that the more removed the clinician was, the better for being able to kind of make unclouded interpretations of what was psychoactive, or I should, since psychoactive has different meanings now, but was psychodynamic, was acting upon the psyche of the client. So there are all kinds of critiques of psychoanalysis and Freudian theory. I've just just scratched the surface of them. I should also say that in lots of ways, Freud was onto something, and really for the first time in Western society, naming it in ways that could be understood and digested on a mass scale, right? That's kind of why, or how it helped psychoanalysis proliferate. So fortunately, because other medical professionals and people who are interested in the human psyche and relieving psychological suffering, they kind of sensed and could tell that Freud was onto something. There was a foundation to build upon. These other sort of giants in the field, or post-Freudian scholar clinicians, they reflected and revised psychoanalytic theory beginning in the wake of World War II to allow more collectivistic, constructivist conceptions of human psychodynamics. So, yes, psychoanalysis is sort of the foundation, it's where it's sort of the cradle of psychotherapy, but here's why we've positioned it past the midpoint of your term. So think of this video and this module as sort of a course reset, okay? To this point, we've introduced and discussed systems perspectives to human development as they related to relieving suffering and promoting well-being. We've introduced and explored the implications of models, namely structural family therapy, strategic family therapy, as sort of like our classic models. We've also talked about solution-focused family therapy and narrative family therapy as sort of primary constructivist models to assisting families with relieving their suffering. But I should say that all four of these models we've discussed have currently experiential and constructivist sort of aspects to them, features to them, that can provide a framework for understanding how the family as a social system can support and or inhibit human well-being. So now we circle back and fill in some of the painting within the framework so that you can have a clearer view of how human psychodynamics manifest within systems, and then also can be leveraged or used to relieve suffering and promote well-being by the very self-aware, skillful clinician. So this sort of filling in the painting will become particularly important as we move into experiential and intergenerational models in the coming weeks, and it should also help enhance your own reflection upon your development within your family for your family of origin analysis paper, and of course for your practice as a professional counselor in general when the time comes for that. So one of the main, perhaps the main thing I want to draw out from the reading on your chapter on psychodynamics and family therapy, the main thing I want to draw out and comment more deeply on is the phenomenon or concept of intersubjectivity, okay? Especially as it relates to the transference, countertransference sort of phenomenon, and how, the transference and countertransference are kind of like common terms that I'm sure you've gone over with your theories instructors and your techniques instructors, especially as it relates to providing individual psychotherapy. So the family therapy sort of equivalent term, this is a new term for at least this this course at this point, the equivalent is sort of parallel process, okay? This is the way in which clinicians in a family context, especially when you're doing conjoint therapy, and I should say, this is also very important when you're doing supervision of new counseling trainees and pre-professionals, parallel process is one of the ways in which we leverage transference, countertransference in a therapeutic dynamic that involves multiple levels, whether it be generations or just sort of you've got a couple and a clinician, or you've got a clinician and parents. You may have a supervisor somewhere in there too. I don't mean to muddy the waters, but hopefully you understand what I mean by that. And maybe it'll become more clear, hopefully become more clear in just a few moments. So, again, intersubjectivity relates to or tries to capture how we as clinicians can use the transference countertransference dynamics in the parallel process for the purposes of assisting families with the see it, name it, change it process. We'll start out, we'll move now into a bit of a story that I will use to kind of hopefully make these terms a little bit more applicable or usable in your own minds for now. So let me introduce you to Stephanie. Stephanie is a 32-year-old single woman who has started dating Bobby within the last 6 months. Bobby is a 32-year-old single man. And by Stephanie's account, things are going mostly pretty well. They spend weekends together. The energy between them is generally very positive. They have a lot in common, find each other very attractive, appreciate each other's sense of humor, and have similar enough experiences in their backgrounds that they have generally had a common language for understanding each other and appreciating each other. So that being said, within the past 2 or 3 weeks, Stephanie has told her friend Maria that she has started to notice a pattern in Bobby's responses to her that has confused Stephanie, that is. So here's an example. So during a telephone conversation the other day, Stephanie and Bobby were talking about past experiences with traveling. And Stephanie was recalling a trip she had taken with a now ex-boyfriend to Europe. She noticed that Bobby was a little uncomfortable with the topic, which she explained to herself as sort of understandable given the fact that she was talking about an ex. From her point of view, she was just telling a story in the context of their conversation that happened to include an ex. Now, Bobby asked how long she was on the trip with the ex, and Stephanie responded in that moment that she could not remember. It happened a while ago. She had no interest in the ex anymore and hadn't thought about the trip in terms of duration in a long time. But later in the conversation, sort of her memory was jogged and she said, oh yeah, now I remember. We must have been in Europe for more than a week because we were there over the Christmas, New Year's holiday season, and we did some Christmas markets and some New Year's stuff. And so that was kind of what she remembered and brought back up. And Bobby responded with an elevated and defensive tone of voice that went something kind of like this. What? You're just telling me I have to rub it in my face. And so, of course, Stephanie at this point is stunned because that was not her intention at all. And this is what she talked about with Maria, who confirmed to Stephanie that Bobby's response sounded off to her too. Now, keep that story sort of in the back of your mind. We'll come back to it in just a moment. So, intersubjectivity is the outgrowth of Freudian drive or motivation theory, which lay the foundation for object relations theory to come to be. This posits that our motivations are influenced by relationships in ways that are greater than or more powerful than hunger, shivering, reflexes, those sort of internal physiological and psychological activities that are common to all of us. Okay? And object relations theory then was sort of the precursor to attachment theory, right? Which posits that we develop neurological connections that manifest as expectations for how others will receive and or reject or neglect us. Now, John Bowlby, who we talked about before, named these expectations as the internal working model, okay? Especially when it comes to our relationships with our primary attachment figures, right? So the internal working model is sort of the unconscious operation of the attachment behavioral system, okay, in our own psyche, right? And so as you'll remember, when the little person's on top of the circle, they are exploring the world, and it's the big person's job to support that exploration. And then something weird happens. Could be anything to alert the small person that they have some type of need, and they get on the bottom of the circle, and they come home. They are seeking safety, soothing, and assistance with sense making of what the X was, whatever the X experience is. And of course, it is the big person's job to welcome the return, act as a safe haven, provide the safety, soothing, and sense making for the child. And then as this is happening super tight at first, and then it slows down over time, and we add new relationships in and all that jazz. So, and all that to say, this process here sort of is what shapes our expectations for how the big person is going to respond. And it's active really kind of all the time, right? And it has an effect upon really the parenting process, the erotic romantic process, and the therapeutic process. So keep that in mind, that this is the internal working model, all right? This was sort of what John Bowlby theorized about, and Mary Ainsworth, who was a protege and then close colleague of Bowlby's until they both passed on in the late 90s. Mary Ainsworth, of course, confirmed the validity of the IWM, or the internal working model, in children through her research that featured, of course, the strength situation assessment. And then Mary Main, who is a contemporary of ours, she is still an active professor of developmental psychology at the University of California at Berkeley. So Mary Main, in the mid-90s, developed an instrument that I think I may have told you about, called the adult attachment interview. It is the sort of adult equivalent of the strength situation. And her work showed that the IWM, the internal working model, and the related relational or that is attachment patterns persist into adulthood, right? Or in other words, they persist to the level of representation, right? So what that means is that the internal working model can be found in symbolism. For example, our romantic erotic partner becomes symbols of primary attachment figures, and we project onto them our expectations of how they will respond to us in terms of their support of our exploration and welcoming of our return. Can they help us with soothing, sense-making, feeling safe? And sort of this shapes our expectations in relationships, right? Now, this projection of the internal working model, in many ways, at least in the therapeutic world, this is sort of another way of calling it transference, right? So the client in therapy is transferring their IWM, their internal working model, onto the therapist, right? And that creates sort of fertile ground for exploration, recognition. This is happening unconsciously, and the therapist's job is to sort of notice it, illuminate it, and make it conscious, or in other words, make the implicit explicit, okay? So, intersubjectivity suggests that personality development and expression are the product of co-created experiences between us and the people with whom we relate, especially within our intimate relationships. In other words, personality development and expression are the product of the interplay between transference, or the unconscious projection of the internal working model onto another, and countertransference, or the unconscious projection of the other's internal working model onto the person in the inverse way of transference. So that's sort of a muddled way of saying sort of this sort of diagram here. Now, in our peer relationships, or sort of like our relationships where there's not much of a power dynamic or hierarchy or difference, this sort of, I guess, transference is happening both ways, right? Countertransference comes in when you have sort of a power dynamic. So you have like the therapist-client, or you have the parent-child, okay? So coming back over here to the ABS, the IWM, okay, ... is unconsciously affecting the attachment figure, which then influences how the attachment figure supports exploration and influences how the attachment figure welcomes a return, okay? And then that gets transmuted to the child, or the one down, the small person, right? And then kind of becomes sort of a internal working model for them too. So we mentioned earlier in the semester that if you can predict a big person's sort of attachment category or primary attachment pattern through the adult attachment interview, then you can predict the little person's attachment pattern through the strange situation. You can predict the small person's attachment pattern at a 75% success rate, which of course is an extraordinarily high correlative power, okay? And it's explained, at least in part, by this phenomenon of the internal working model projecting, being transferred or counter-transferred to the child, and then the child transferring it back, and round we go, okay? And then the parallel process piece is that this also plays out with other people, namely the therapist, right? So, let me see if I can go back to my notes and remember all that I just said, right? So, intersubjectivity suggests that personality development and expression are a product of co-created experiences between us and the people with whom we relate, especially within our intimate relationships. In other words, personality development and expression are the product of the interplay between transference and countertransference. It also suggests that if we become aware of the ways in which transference and countertransference are affecting us, then we can leverage it to make changes that enhance our well-being within our own circumstances, both internally, psychologically, and ecologically, right? So we can we can influence or change the way we respond to the dynamics of the external systems that are acting upon us. Think Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, right? Okay, so this phenomenon, of course, is useful in individual psychotherapy because it enables the self-aware clinician to artfully experience or see and draw attention to or name manifestations of the relational patterns that maintain a client's presenting problem. Okay? And the couples and family therapy tweak of this is known as parallel process. So we as the clinicians join the family in a way that allows us to be, quote unquote, inducted into their system or their club, so to speak, or welcomed in, sort of encouraged, if not explicitly, then implicitly to participate in the ways in which the family already operates. You saw this at play in the Lomax family from the structural family therapy sort of discussion board, where certain people in the family would look toward the therapist in a way that sort of seems to suggest or an unsaid message of, see what I'm having to deal with here, or can you help me please? Sort of looking for an endorsement of their conceptualization of the experience. That's sort of a inductive move. They're pulling the therapist into a triangle of sorts, an alliance against whoever they've sort of vilified in the family. And so when we're inducted like that, the skillful therapist can recognize what's happening. Oh, there's that thing, right? And then artfully step back out and then shed light on or wonder about, kind of do the old Columbo or Matlock, I'm not from around here, but here's what I'm noticing. Can you help me understand X, Y, and Z? I wonder if, so the way to kind of leverage intersubjectivity is for the therapist to recognize, here's what happened to me, here's what I felt and experienced when this thing happened, either between us or between y'all. And I wonder if that sounds familiar to you. Have other people responded this way to you? What do you think that's about? Wondering about it. So, again, we as the clinicians join the family in a way that allows us to be inducted into their system, notice the maladaptive cybernetic patterns, name them in a way that invites change, and then we facilitate change through enactments of the pattern, regardless, in every model, structural, strategic, solution-focused, narrative, as well as experiential and other models we'll get to later in the term. Each model poses specific approaches or interventions to creating enactments of new developmentally supportive ways of being and working together. The parallel process element suggests that the intersubjective experience between one family member and the clinician mirrors, that is, runs parallel to the intersubjective experience between the member and others in the couple or family. So one way of leveraging this is for the clinician to intervene by noticing transference and countertransference exchanges with one or more couple or family members. Notice it, invite mutual curiosity about it, including wondering if it is possible that something similar is happening between the family members. You can then facilitate the see it step by guiding the family members to talk about it, and then can flow into the name it and change it steps with monitoring. So, let's go back to our example of Stephanie and Bobby. And as we do that, I'm going to step over here. I don't know if you'll be able to see. Here we go. I'm going to get a little bit of water. So, Stephanie has noticed that Bobby's response to her is a little bit unsettling. She feels unsettled because it does not seem to match. The impact of her actions don't seem to match her intentions, right? And so, if we were acting maybe as a couples therapist for Stephanie and Bobby, one approach that leverages intersubjectivity might be to notice, like Maria did, yeah, something, I hear you, I hear what you described, and based on what you've described, yeah, something sounds a little off, like you're out of sync here, like you were just sharing a story from your point of view, you're just sharing a story that's in the context of your conversation with Bobby, and Bobby is sort of assigning intention to you that you claim not to have. And so I, as the therapist now, I'm wondering, so how did that come to be? How is it possible that you can be so out of sync given that you've been so successful in other arenas, around other topics? And then, let's say Stephanie says, well, I don't know either, that's why I'm coming to you. Well, I'm curious what you might find out if you presented it to Bobby just like I presented it to you. Now, Bobby might come back to Stephanie and say, because you randomly brought it back up without any sort of prompting. It felt personal. It felt like you were doing it to hurt me. And so, depending on how Stephanie handles that, let's just say that she feels flustered by it, right? What we're seeing is probably some projection of each member of the couple's internal working model upon the other, right? And so you as a clinician in this case might step in and maybe go to Bobby this time and say, so Bobby, isn't it interesting that, or at least I find it interesting, that you've had such good conversations and with Stephanie up to this point, and this is sort of the first, at least I'm hearing, of sort of suspicion that she has any kind of malicious intent toward you. So I'm really curious, like, if there's ever been a previous experience that Stephanie's behavior is reminding you of. Has this ever happened to you before, essentially? And it's at that point that Bobby talks about, well, I don't know, but what is occurring for me as you ask that question, Charles, is, my dad and I don't get along, right? My dad is, has a very different perspective on the world than I do, and growing up, I was kind of expected to follow his leadership, even if I didn't agree with it. And then there were times I can remember a couple of examples right now where my dad sort of what I would think of as passive aggressively brought up things that he had done or that I had done in a way that were intended to, I felt really ashamed, and I felt really powerless, and like I was being compared to somebody else. And so I as a therapist might say, okay, so interesting. Like as you were talking about that, I had some things come up for me too, that were sort of examples of my own life, something similar happening. And yeah, that's terrible. It feels awful. You might even notice kind of somatically what's happening in your body. Like, so as I'm talking about that, I'm feeling like a heaviness in my chest, and like I'm wondering, are you feeling something similar? And wherever that goes, it doesn't necessarily, sometimes people do sort of mirror those emotions. That is perhaps a topic for another class related to sort of the effect of mirror neurons. But all that to say, I wonder, do you think it's possible that your response to Stephanie in this conversation, which in the grand scheme of things, this response seems to be fairly isolated, do you think that it's possible that this response is about more than the conversation with Stephanie? This is an opportunity to help Bobby or whoever sort of open their mind and reflect upon, what is really going on here? Is it possible that I am projecting my internal working model onto someone who's not involved in the internal working model? And, most of us have the intention of having intimate experiences that are better than our family of origin experiences, regardless of how great your family was, right? No family is perfect, and we want typically to live a life that has a high ratio of sort of well-being to in a low sort of quotient, or so to speak, of suffering. So you're using intersubjectivity to help a person kind of reflect and sort of create sort of a more coherent narrative that better explains the here and now response. So, so you take it back to Bobby, and Bobby has an opportunity to kind of sort through it. Okay. Now, that's an example of how you might work with it in a couple. Let's think of it as, let's shift it now into working with a family and a parent-child dyad, okay? So remember, the parent's internal working model is affecting the parent's sort of support of exploration and the welcoming of the return, right? And so, depending on the presenting problem, oftentimes what we will find is that the parent is assigning some type of maladaptive intention or pathology to a child's disruptive, inconvenient, difficult behavior, okay? And so, my kid is bad. My kid won't listen. Those types of things come up. So, you have an opportunity sometimes to imagine or connect with the experience of the child, right? So the child didn't exit the womb with any malicious intention, right? Now, there's all kinds of things that could be genetically influencing what's going on, but let's say we have a typically developing child, right, just for the sake of argument. And so, typically children, for a parent to assign intention upon the child beyond the child just trying to get their needs met can really be problematic and really serves to, or demonstrates or illuminates that the parent is working out some of their own sort of maladaptive patterns on the child. So we have an opportunity to recognize it. So whenever I hear you say your child is bad, or your child won't listen, I get really curious about that because it sounds like your child is hearing you. However, your child is not following your lead. You're not following your directions. Do you have any idea why that might be? No, I don't have any idea why that might be. I think my child essentially is defective. Okay, well, that makes me curious too, because that's not typically what, and you're being diplomatic at this point, not typically what, or how developmental science would characterize the behavior of children. Children are really just trying to explore and understand their world and make sense of what's going on, right? And they don't have the neurological development or capability to do that well until they're in their mid-20s, so they rely upon the experience and knowledge of their big people. So there could be all kinds of different things going on for your child, but it seems like their malicious intent toward you would really be a low odds possibility. So I'm starting to wonder, is there anything about your experience with your child that reminds you of previous experiences? Could be with anybody, could be, but I'm also mostly interested in your experiences with your own parents. And see what you might illuminate there, because you're probably dealing with some type of intersubjective experience, transference, countertransference between the parent and child, that is sort of maintaining this maladaptive pattern of the parent assigning intent to the child beyond the child just trying to get their basic needs met. So, you may also get a response from the parent that is emblematic or symbolic of what the parent does with the child. They may try to transfer that onto you, okay? And you have an opportunity to kind of feel that and name that and wonder about it. And then also wonder, how is the parent trying to do the same thing the child is doing? How is the parent trying to get their own basic needs met, okay? And wondering about, did the parent ever get their basic needs met from their big people? And how has that influenced their internal working model of how relationships are supposed to go, right? And then you have an opportunity to kind of sort through, talk about, tweak, make corrections, and sort of shape the parent's ability to be a secure base to explore, sort of support exploration and not be threatened by it. And to also remain available, both emotionally and physically, in terms of proximity, to welcome the return, be open, flexible, and kind toward the child, and to help the child think critically about what has happened to them, perhaps narrating it for them, providing effective soothing, and conveying a sense of safety, like I'm not afraid of what you have to bring to me, and if you are afraid, I can protect you. So, that's a lot, but, and you'll notice that intersubjectivity was a sort of a smidge of your chapter 7 reading. In this case, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the validity or the value of an intersubjective sort of understanding upon cybernetics and the therapeutic process. We are looking for transference, countertransference dynamics and finding out how it's mirroring what's happening in the family and leveraging that parallel process to help the family see, name, and then change their patterns in a way that supports their development rather than inhibits it. You can see, I would hope, how something similar would happen in a supervisor-supervisee relationship. So the supervisor wonders what's happening for the supervisee. That may be sort of a manifestation or a symbol of what's happening in the family, in the couple, whatever the case may be, and then sort of guiding the supervisee on how to make use of that new awareness. So that's sort of my take on intersubjectivity. I hope you found it useful. If you have questions or concerns or comments, I'd love to hear them. And I'm looking very much forward to seeing how all of this manifests in your family of origin analysis papers. And so for now, we will pause and I look forward to seeing you next time in Module 6. Thanks.